did you come to be teaching at University of Montreal? Like how did you get your start?
Yes.
Like,
so I studied, I'm originally from Brussels in Belgium. So I studied there. I did my master's and PhD in Brussels, and it was in a journalism and communications program. When I finished my PhD, I applied to a job at the University of Montreal, and that's how I arrived here in Montreal. So it's in the communications department. And my specialty, my area of expertise is journalism, and well, more specifically, digital journalism and technologies and journalism. So that's what I did during my PhD, and what I'm still doing right now. So I'm teaching and researching media journalism and technologies broadly.
so a lot of this project focuses on trust in media. And you wrote an article for The Atlantic about podcasting, and about how like you write about sensationalism, like not in the sense of an exaggeration, but the way in which sensations inform our knowledge. And it made me think of Stephen Colbert's concept of truthiness.
Yes.
And things like feeling true. But trust is a feeling. So how important do you think feelings and intuition are to our perception of truth in media, and how does technology like impact that?
Mm-hmm. I think that you're right to underline that trust is a feeling, and it's something that we deeply feel sometimes in our gut, right? So it's definitely something that we must account for, but it doesn't mean that trust or truth is something that's entirely subjective, because sometimes that's the sort of the leap that people make when they say that, right? If trust is a feeling, then it's only a question of feeling, right? And I can trust anything, but it's not entirely subjective, because when we trust someone, we rely on objective things, and by objective things I mean that it's things that exist in the world, right? So that's the complicated interrelationship between those things that populate the world, and how we feel them, and how we can rely on those things to trust people, organizations, news content, and so on. So I think that the main problem here is maybe that we think about trust or about facts or about truth in binary terms. This is true, or this is not true. This is a fact, this is not a fact. But I think that you have limitations in those approaches, and I think that it might be more relevant to think about those things in terms of degrees or on a scale. It's more true, or it's something that I'm more certain of, or something like that. And I think that for journalists and news in general, it's important, because we must realize that it's incredibly difficult for journalists to depict the world in a completely accurate fashion. It's almost impossible, right? And I think that most journalistic content that we see is actually the best approximation we can have of reality, right? It's not perfect, it's not 100% reality, but it's the best we can have, or it's something that approaches the best. So thinking about this in terms of scale or degrees or anything that's not binary is important, I think.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of fact-checking organizations have like a scale that they rate.
Yes.
Like it's not just true or false, it's like true, misleading, like a little bit true, a little bit like, yeah. So why should the public trust the media?
Because they are the only professionals whose job is to actually do that. So to account for the world around us. There are people those people spend their days working on doing that. So it's the best we have right now. So we have no choice trusting them, because that's what they do, and I think we need them as a society.
You write about also cutting and pasting, like pre-computers, like the history of cutting and pasting. So I guess, I mean, speed is never conducive to like originality. Like somebody is always going to get a story first and is usually not going to be you, right? Like, but it seems like with computers, like replicating errors gets easier, or is, I mean, maybe not. Maybe it was always the case. Was it always the case? Actually, I should ask you that first.
I don't know, because it's extremely difficult to quantify, right? We don't know if, I mean, everything is easy to replicate. Do we replicate more errors than actual facts or some things that are more true? I don't know. It's almost impossible to count that. So, but I think you're right to say that what technologies change is the speed at which everything moves, right? So that's the key difference. But does technology create more errors or replicate more errors? I mean, my work on cut and paste comes from that problem, right? It's not the computers that create the cut and paste problem. It's something that journalists or people in media already did before that, and it was and not because they wanted to plagiarize everything or circulate rumors, but because that's what they needed to create content for the media they worked for. So it's not about demonizing those things, but understanding why they are here and how they work.
Should journalists always do their own reporting, or is there some sources that you can just trust, like the Canadian press? Like, do you need to fact check that, or should you just, like, are there some sources that people should just trust, or is, like, what's your opinion of that?
I think it depends. That's not an interesting answer, right? But it depends. I mean, sometimes in some cases, it's really interesting for the audience to have journalists doing original reporting and uncovering new facts and so on. But in other contexts, I mean, for someone reading a general newspaper, I just want to be informed of the news of the day. And if some parts of that newspaper comes from the Associated Press or the Canadian Press or whatever, it works, right? I don't mind if the journalists did not do the reporting themselves. So I think it depends, and also it depends on the audience that is targeted by each media. And that's also the problem when we talk about journalism as if it were a single thing, right? Actually, you have many different kinds, different forms of journalism, different genres too. If you have like if you want a good analysis. A good analysis could be based on reports from the Canadian press, right? And then you have the journalist actually analyzing the facts that are there and telling you what to think about or how you can understand these things. So this is not original reporting, but it has value. So it also depends on the genres, I think.
Yeah, like something like the sports team won, or like the stock went up or whatever. Like that's not like really, yeah, okay. So do you think that there is like a crisis of lack of trust in media, that or is that crisis like overblown? Like how much of a problem do you think trust in media is?
The thing is that the word crisis has always been used in the world of journalism and media. I mean, there was a crisis in trust in media in the 1920s too, and you see those things come forward quite often. So the idea that there's a crisis. As far as I know, the situation really varies from country to country. So you have parts of the world where trust in media is really low. The US, for example, trust in media is not that good, but other parts of the world where trust in media is actually quite good or quite stable. So it depends again on the context. And I think that I wouldn't say that there is a crisis, because trust in media is something that journalists and media always have to deal with. So it's the normality for them, you know, dealing with those questions and issues and problems. So how can we ensure that the audience trusts us? But it's definitely something that has been at the forefront of public conversations these last years. So yes, it's more prominent. Is it a crisis? I'm not sure.
Do you have like a favorite fact-checking site or fact-checking tool that you use that you like, and why do you like it? Like Snopes or like a online tool or any of this?
I'm actually not a user of fact-checking tools or websites. I'm happy they exist, but I don't use them. I'm more familiar with the fact-checking teams within media organizations. For example, Radio-Canada has Les Décrypteurs, a group which has a Facebook group and so on. So this is something that I follow a little bit more closely. But in them independent fact-checking organizations, I might not be the audience for that. I don't know. I find it tedious to read, and also it seems it's a bit depressing. And this is really personal, right? Because I think what they do is really necessary, and I'm happy they exist. But I find it a bit depressing to see how everyone is wrong all the time, and nothing is actually really factually accurate, and this is a little bit depressing.
I think like you quoted that quote from James Carey, that like the secret at the heart of journalism is that like objectivity is a practice that is never quite believed by its practitioners. Like journalists, I guess, yeah. But anyways, does these kinds of independent fact checking or I maybe just in general, like the online world, I guess there is some element of like holding the media accountable. Is that make for more objective reporting, like, or do you think it doesn't?
Yeah, I think that the problem here is what we mean by objectivity, right? And for journalists, if you look at the history of journalism, objectivity usually means the separation between facts on the one hand and values on the other hand, right? That's usually that's how journalism built itself as a professional group, right? Starting at the beginning of the 20th century and so on. Yeah. This idea that we need to separate facts from value, which didn't exist in journalism in the 19th century, for example. But anyway, that's not the point. So this is the traditional conception of conceptualization of objectivity, and this is what doesn't work, right? This is the core value that practitioners don't really believe in, because this is impossible, right? Completely separating facts from values is something that's not possible. Everything we do is infused with values, and that's to a certain extent that's okay. So if you think that objectivity is that, of course it's impossible, and I'm not sure that fact-checking initiatives actually help, because you know the argument, like the fact-checking initiatives are also value-laden in a way, if only because they believe that there is an objective truth that is attainable and so on. So I think that the problem is thinking about objectivity in those terms. But if you think about objectivity in other terms, and there's a paper I wrote with a colleague called Networks of Reference. I don't know. I don't remember the title exactly, but I can send you the paper. And in that paper, we argued that you can think of objectivity not as the separation between facts and value, but as something that you can gradually build when you add what we call chains of references. So connections to things in the world, like for example, a source that tells you something, and then you have also a picture of the same thing, and so on. So you can add all these different things, and when you add all these different things, what you present to the public as a journalist is actually more objective than something that doesn't have all all these different things. So again, it's about thinking of objectivity in terms of degrees. And if you do that, fact-checking initiatives actually are super helpful, because they help making the journalistic facts or journalistic articles more solid, right, and more resistant to doubt or to questions or to objections. So yeah, that's the crucial difference, I think.
Yeah, I did read that. I wasn't sure. And one of the things that you wrote, I wasn't sure if I really understood it, but it sounded interesting. It was the Montreal school of like that everything has to work together, like the building, the computers. Like, can you explain a little bit about that? Like,
yeah, that's the relational ontology, right? And the basic idea is that things and beings and us and everything do not exist in and out of themselves, but we exist because we are in relation with the many other things that exist in the world. So, for example, when I explain things to you like I'm doing right now, I'm not alone, right? When I speak with all the research that I've read in my life. I speak with the experience that I have and the things that I've done. So I'm not alone in speaking. And so what's important when you think about knowledge, when you think about existence in general, is that we must acknowledge those relations and those relations, and the fact that something is never extracted from its environment or doesn't exist in and out of itself.
Kind of like an ongoing conversation.
Yes.
To go down for like the past, whatever, your whole professional life, and then
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any thoughts about blockchain and journalism that you want to share? Like, do you have a opinion?
I don't have an opinion on that. I've watched the video that you sent me. I think it's interesting, and I'm interested in seeing how this can be used creatively to help journalism. So that's nice. And to be honest, I think I understand what blockchain is, but I'm not sure. So no, let me rephrase that. I understand what it is. I'm not sure I understand how it can be used in the context of facts and fact checking and journalism and so on. But I'm curious, and I think it can be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so far, like most of the experiments haven't worked, like civil and stuff. But I mean, it is like pretty early. Like there's only like been a few experiments with it. So, is there any like thoughts that you wanted to share about fact checking in general? Like, is there something missing, or is it like something that is like, is there a need for different tools or more tools? Or
I don't know if it's a need for tools, but things or original ways to show uncertainty in news articles and in journalism, and this appeared obviously in the last year or so with the COVID, with the pandemic and so on, because we learned the hard way that, for example, scientific facts are not that solid, right? It's not that they are not solid, but it changes quite fast. And sometimes, and at the beginning of the pandemic, there were many aspects that we just weren't so sure about. And even, scientists didn't know, and journalists didn't know. So how can journalism make sure that it tells the public and the audience what it knows, but also the sort of the degree of uncertainty that is associated with what the journalists are trying to say. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I read an article by Ed Young, who is a science journalism working for The Atlantic. And this was a really, really long article about the pandemic, about COVID-19. And the main point of this article was to say what we don't know yet. And I found that extremely brilliant and extremely reassuring, even though it said that there are so many aspects of the pandemic that we didn't know or didn't understand yet. Just knowing what we didn't know was extremely helpful. And this is not something that journalists usually do. Sorry for the cat. So this is not something that journalists usually do, because by training they want to tell the facts and they want to tell the audience what they actually know. But finding ways of explaining what we don't know might be something missing, maybe.
Like maybe being more transparent about methods and like how, like, it would be cool to see like data visualizations that show, instead of just showing like, that would be cool to see in a visualization, like to see like some kind of like, I don't know, like to be able to see like the holes and like, I don't know.
And for example, when you have data visualization that report on surveys and you have percentages of people, like 30% of people don't want a vaccine or something, it would be quite easy to also show on the data visualization to also show the confidence interval for that survey, right? This is a measure of uncertainty that we have and that scientists use and that people at the polling agencies use. So let's also have journalists use those very simple things that can communicate uncertainty, and that you can visualize that quite easily. But journalists prefer to have, no, it's exactly 37.5, but it's 37.5, right? It's always a little bit fuzzy, and that fuzziness is really, in some cases it's really difficult to convey, but in some cases it's quite easy.
I read an interesting, I can't remember I read it, but I read an interesting article that was like somebody's like personal, like they wrote like an opinion piece about why they won't make COVID-19 visualization. And it's just like, I don't know, it was interesting because you don't often hear people say like, I don't know enough to be like doing this. Like people might actually use this to make like important decisions about people's health. Like I can't be responsible for this and have it be wrong. Like when there's like the CDC is making their own, like I'm leaving that to like, the experts or whatever.
And you're right, it's also a question of responsibility, right? If I don't want to be responsible for the decisions that people are going to make based on my reporting, but that's the whole point of journalism too. So so we need journalists to do that, but what they do is the best we can have in the context that's ours. So
you can't have people stop reporting just because they're scared to make mistakes.
Exactly.
You just have no information, which isn't well, and that void will be filled with like less reliable information.
And quite similarly, I think that we shouldn't expect to have only information or only reports that are completely accurate. That's just not possible, right? We know that most of the journalism that is produced contain some sort of mistakes or inaccuracies or something. So let's just aim for the best we can do and acknowledge that it's not perfect, and maybe we'll be better as a society. I don't know.
I think you can, like, how do you think it's you might like help the public understand that, or like what do you think would help people?
I think that again it's related with the question of trust, and what we see is that some members of the public, I think that the public is actually quite aware that journalism isn't perfect and that journalists make mistakes all the time, but sometimes the danger here is that when people are aware that journalism is not perfect, it can lead to severe mistrust, and it can lead to people actually not trusting media organizations anymore, or not trusting them at all. So there's maybe a sweet spot here. And as educators and you know, people in higher education, I think we have a responsibility here, is that to educate people. You know, you always hear people saying, oh, we need more media literacy, and we need people to understand how the media work and so on. And yes, we do. But the problem is that when those efforts in media literacy lead to mistrust. So how can we help people understand that the media work in a certain way? And yes, I mean, you have influence, you have economic influence that weigh on the media, you have professional routines that weigh on how journalists do their job, and you know, they work under a lot of pressure and they don't have a lot of time. So what they produce is imperfect, but it doesn't mean that we should just throw everything away and not trust them. So this is the sweet spot. I don't know how exactly we achieve that, but I think it's a challenge, especially for us.